Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable day you never expect to mark a permanent shift in your life. When I sat down for dinner with my parents for what I thought would be just another bland, passive-aggressive evening at the Carter household, a plate of overcooked meatloaf, strained conversation about local news, and the usual quiet reminder that I'd overstayed my welcome, even if nobody had yet said the words out loud. But that night, something was different, and I felt it in the way my mother poured my glass of sweet tea without looking at me, in the way my father kept clenching and unclenching his jaw like he was psyching himself up for something. I passed the gravy bowl across the table, mostly out of habit, and that's when the grenade landed. My father cleared his throat, loud and sharp, and said, without flinching, "Melissa, this isn't working anymore. You're dead weight. We need our house back." At first, I thought I had misheard him, or that he was building up to a joke. A really twisted one, maybe, but I glanced at my mother, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just folded her napkin into a smaller square and pushed her green beans around like she wasn't watching her only daughter's stomach bottom out. My first instinct was silence, not because I was calm, but because I felt a strange buzzing between my ears, like the air had been sucked out of the room and replaced with static. I opened my mouth to speak, and nothing came. "Dead weight," I repeated, more to myself than to them. And my father gave a small, satisfied nod, like that was the magic phrase he'd been rehearsing all afternoon. "Now, I need to tell you something before we go any further, something that'll make you ask the same question I've been asking myself since that night. How does a grown woman end up living with her parents in the first place?" The answer, like most answers that don't fit on bumper stickers, is complicated. I moved back in 3 years ago after I lost my job. Laid off from an events management firm during a corporate restructuring, which is just a fancy way of saying they replaced us with software. At the time, I had a choice. Spend what was left of my savings surviving in a studio apartment while I searched for new work, or accept my parents' offer to move back, just for a little while. That little while stretched out like taffy until it became years, during which I worked 2 freelance gigs, picked up groceries, drove them to doctor appointments, and slowly started covering more of the bills. Not because they asked, but because the fridge was getting emptier and the mail was getting scarier. Somewhere along the line, I became less of a guest and more of a utility. And despite all of that, here I was being discarded like expired milk. They didn't even yell. That's the part that got me. There was no anger, no shouting match, just a calm decision delivered like a business memo. They wanted their space back. They didn't feel it was healthy for me to be dependent, and most galling of all, they thought I should figure things out like Eric had. Eric, my younger brother, who called once every few months and sent them a Christmas card with his family's names printed by a third-party service. Eric, who'd moved to Arizona and ghosted the responsibility of their aging bodies the moment he got the chance. But he was the model child, the benchmark. I was the one taking up too much oxygen. You ever feel that burning pressure behind your eyes when you know if you blink too hard, you'll cry in front of people who don't deserve to see it? That was me. I looked at both of them, and something snapped. Not in an explosive way, but in that clean, cold way when you realize someone has shown you exactly who they are and you believe them. I nodded once, slowly, then set down my fork. My voice didn't tremble when I said it. I wish it had, honestly, because it might have sounded less cruel. "I stopped paying your medical insurance 2 months ago." I watched it hit them like a delayed detonation. My mother blinked rapidly, like she didn't understand the language I was speaking. My father's lips parted, but no sound came out. Just that heavy, loaded silence, louder than any scream they could have mustered. I didn't add anything else. I didn't explain that I'd stopped not out of pettiness, but out of necessity. My freelance income was drying up. I was behind on my own bills, and they never once acknowledged the help I gave them. I stood up, pushed in my chair, and walked toward the hallway, each step echoing like I was walking through a tunnel. And before I left the house, my childhood home turned prison cell, I went into the drawer near the kitchen phone, the one nobody really touched anymore, except to stuff envelopes or collect expired coupons. I opened it and pulled out the small manila folder I'd tucked away weeks ago. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody saw me do it. But inside that folder was a copy of a notarized power of attorney, something my father had signed in a moment of panic during a hospital stay last winter when they thought he was having a minor stroke. Back then, they wanted me in charge. Back then, I was responsible. I walked out the front door with it tucked under my arm. And maybe that was the real moment they should have started to worry. Because here's my question to you. How many of us have let guilt chain us to a version of love that's more about obligation than care? How long do you keep giving before you realize you're the only one bleeding? Tell me below honestly. Have you ever had to choose between being the good child and being free? That night, I didn't cry. I drove to a cheap motel and lay awake for hours, not grieving, not angry, just calculating. Not planning revenge, not yet, but knowing something deep inside had shifted. That dinner table execution didn't kill me, it just lit a fuse. And I don't think they realized what they'd set in motion, not yet. It's funny how quiet revenge can be, how it doesn't always come in the form of shouting, slammed doors, or wild threats hurled across the porch in the rain, but instead curls up beside you like a sleeping dog, patient and low to the ground, waiting for the right moment to stretch its legs and bare its teeth. In the days following that dinner, after my parents had calmly stripped me of whatever remained of my dignity and left me with the parting gift of silence, I found myself walking through a kind of emotional fog. Not entirely broken, but not whole either, operating on autopilot while my brain worked overtime behind the scenes, connecting dots that had long been floating freely, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't allowed myself to assemble until they threw the first real punch. I checked into a month-to-month apartment complex just outside of town. Nothing special, just beige walls, thin carpets, and the faint smell of mildew that never really left, no matter how many candles I lit. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was silent. There was no sound of my father clearing his throat in disapproval, no clatter of dishes my mother passive-aggressively slammed into the sink when she wanted to remind me I hadn't offered to clean, no subtle emotional taxes that came with existing under their roof. For the first time in years, I could hear myself think. And what I thought about more than anything was the quiet folder I'd taken with me, the one with my father's trembling signature at the bottom, authorizing me, his dead-weight daughter, to make financial decisions on his behalf if he was ever incapacitated. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had given me the tool, signed it with his own pen, handed me the power without realizing the kind of daughter he'd been grooming all these years. Not a pushover, not a doormat, but someone who had learned patience, who had learned to wait until the curtain fell before stepping onto the stage. When he gave me that authority, he was desperate. I remember the moment like it was a still frame. He was pale, strapped to a gurney in the ER, sweating from a false alarm that he swore was a stroke, his voice trembling when he asked the nurse for paperwork, just in case. And my mother, teary-eyed beside him, nodding when the nurse asked if I was the responsible one. Ironic, isn't it, how quickly people forget the words they've spoken when they no longer need what they begged for. At the time, I'd signed without thinking. I didn't expect to ever use it, but now in the quiet of my own space, I opened the folder and stared at the document for a long time, not because I was unsure of what I would do, but because I was calculating what they might do in return, and whether they had the spine to actually fight me or if their cruelty only thrived when I was under their roof, paying their bills like a ghost servant in a house that wasn't mine. I didn't act right away. That would have been too easy, too impulsive. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer, one I found through a local women's group who dealt with financial elder abuse. Although my situation was the mirror image of what they usually handled, she looked at the papers, then looked at me and asked, gently but firmly, "Why do you want to keep this power of attorney active?" I didn't answer her right away because the truth felt like a confession. Not that I wanted to hurt them, but that I didn't want to protect them anymore. I told her I wanted to make sure nothing got mismanaged. That was technically true, but it was only part of the truth. In the days that followed, I began to peel back the layers of my parents' finances. Not illegally, not even unethically, since I had every right to monitor their accounts. But I approached it like someone digging through the wreckage of a house that had burned down years ago, only no one had bothered to move out. What I found wasn't surprising, but it was infuriating. They weren't just careless, they were bleeding money through terrible decisions, buying things they didn't need, renewing subscriptions they never used, and worst of all, refusing to cut anything that gave them a sense of status. My mother, for instance, was still paying for a designer clothing subscription box she never opened, just so she could brag to her church group about being in touch with the trends, while my father subscribed to a premium cable package that cost more than half a car payment, despite watching only 2 channels. The best part? Their health insurance, which I had paid for out of my own pocket for almost a year, wasn't even the full package they thought it was. They were underinsured, thanks to their constant meddling with paperwork they didn't understand, and my payments had only barely kept them afloat. By the time I stopped paying, I knew it wouldn't take long before reality hit them like a brick wall. And so I waited, not like a villain plotting world domination, but like a woman who had spent her entire life in a house that taught her to be quiet, to be useful, to never speak unless spoken to, and now had finally found the luxury of hearing her own thoughts without apology. I didn't call them, I didn't warn them, I didn't explain the document I'd taken, but I did call their insurance provider, not to cancel anything, not to reinstate anything, but to request a formal printout of all upcoming payments and a breakdown of missed bills. It was legal, meticulous, and chillingly impersonal. I was no longer their daughter in those moments. I was an agent with the power to press buttons they never imagined I would dare to touch. And here's the thing. No one tells you about playing the long game. It's not about anger. It's not about justice. It's about silence, patience, and knowing exactly when to move next. Because while they were still sitting in that house, wondering whether I would come crawling back, I was already 5 steps ahead, ready to make the next move, quietly, calmly, and without a trace of guilt. The thing about family dynamics is that they tend to fossilize when no one challenges them, becoming a kind of social sediment, layered and hardened over time, preserving every misstep and resentment in the form of unspoken rules. And in my family, the clearest rule had always been this: Eric could do no wrong, and I could never do enough right to match him. That unwritten commandment was as old as I was, woven into the walls of our home like the faded wallpaper in the upstairs hallway. And no matter how old we got, no matter how many miles or years separated us, that rule remained intact, untouched, and damn near sacred to my parents. Eric, my younger brother by 3 years, had always been the kind of person who knew how to show up just long enough to earn praise without ever staying long enough to be useful, a master at timing an image, dropping in with flowers on Mother's Day, and sending carefully curated photos of his smiling kids at Christmas, pictures where everything looked warm and loving, like a Hallmark card had come to life, while I stood behind the scenes, sorting prescriptions, fixing their internet, arguing with Medicare reps, and paying bills with a bank account that never quite seemed to recover. After I left, after that dinner that carved a deep, clean cut between me and whatever was left of the Carter family legacy, I knew it would only be a matter of time before they called Eric. He was their emergency contact, their emotional lifeline, the one they would call with tremors in their voices, rehearsed helplessness laced with martyrdom. And so it didn't surprise me at all when my phone lit up with his name 4 days later. The contact photo still the same one from 5 years ago, him holding his first kid in a hospital room, beaming like he'd just discovered fire. I let it ring twice before answering, not because I needed to prepare, but because I wanted him to feel for just a second that I might not pick up. "Hey, Mel," he started, casual, like we'd spoken just last week and not several months ago when he'd called to tell me about his new car. Not asking once about how things were going in the house he never visited. I didn't say anything, just let the silence hang long enough to force him into filling it. "Mom and Dad called, said you, Left kind of suddenly. Everything okay? It was the kind of question that wasn't really a question, more a performance of concern. And I heard in his voice that unmistakable tone, that carefully measured neutrality he always used when he didn't want to commit to either side, just in case things turned. "Everything's fine," I said, my voice flat but steady. And then, with a bit more weight, "They told me I was dead weight, so I gave them their house back." He let out a small, awkward chuckle, the kind that people make when they don't know if they're supposed to laugh or apologize. That's rough. But you know how they get. Dad says things he doesn't mean, and Mom's just, well, she's tired. They're both tired. There it was again, the gentle shifting of blame away from them and toward the ether, as though their behavior had been conjured by exhaustion and not decades of learned selfishness. I didn't bother correcting him, didn't bother trying to argue. I had already learned that truth doesn't matter to people who benefit from the lie. "They'll need help," I said instead, leaning into the bait. "They've got a lot of unpaid medical stuff coming up. You might want to look into it." There was a beat of silence on the other end, and then the inevitable shuffle, the shifting of responsibility like a hot potato. "I mean, I'd love to, but you know how it is out here. 3 kids, daycare, Bree's mom just had surgery." I cut him off before the list of excuses could balloon into a guilt trip. "I'm not asking you to do anything," I said. "Just figured you should be prepared." I could hear him relax slightly, relieved that I wasn't going to ask him to step in, to be the adult son for once instead of the golden boy who floated above the mess. Yeah, good call. I'll check in with them. Make sure they're good." He paused. "You good, though?" I almost laughed, but I didn't. "I'm exactly where I need to be." We ended the call shortly after that, and I sat there for a long time staring at my phone, realizing that for all the years I had spent trying to win my parents' approval, what I had really been doing was competing with a ghost, an image of Eric that never aged, never faltered, and never actually showed up when it mattered. They had built him into a monument, and I was tired of kneeling at its base, but the call had served its purpose, because now I had the one thing I needed: distance. Eric wouldn't step in. He never had. That meant whatever happened next would unfold exactly as it should, without interference, without saviors, and certainly without me playing the role of the family's unpaid nursemaid. That same evening, I logged into my email, pulled up the document I had drafted with the lawyer, and finalized a request to the Department of Veterans Affairs, flagging discrepancies in George Carter's financial statements. Nothing illegal, but enough inconsistencies to warrant a temporary hold on his benefits pending review. I didn't fabricate anything. I simply pointed out what had always been there: poor record-keeping, overlapping insurance claims, questionable spending on non-medical items using his pension card. I signed the email with my full name, with the legal authority granted to me under the power of attorney he had signed without reading the fine print. And then I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window as the sun dipped below the horizon, wondering not if they'd figure out what I had done, but when. It wouldn't take long. Their benefits would freeze within a week, maybe less, and then the calls would start again. First polite, then desperate, then, eventually, furious. But I wasn't scared, not anymore. Because the golden boy wasn't coming, and this time, they'd have to face the cold alone. There's a particular kind of silence that comes before a storm, not the calm and soothing stillness that poets write about, but the sharp, artificial quiet that feels more like pressure building in your ears before a plane takes off. And you know something is about to snap, but you can't predict from which direction it'll hit or how hard. That's what I felt the morning the call finally came. I was in the middle of folding a basket of laundry, mundane, ordinary, nothing remarkable, when my phone began to buzz with the same name I hadn't seen flash across the screen since the night I walked out of that house and never looked back. "Mom, mobile." I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, frozen, one sock in my hand and the other half hung from the basket. Heart thudding just a little faster, not because I was afraid of what she might say, but because a part of me already knew this moment would come and still wasn't sure what version of myself I wanted to be when it did. After 2 rings, I swiped to answer and lifted the phone to my ear, not speaking, letting her go first, because it was her show now, her stage, her choice. Melissa? Her voice was thinner than I remembered, like it had been strained through grief or desperation, and for the first time in years, she didn't speak with that tight confidence she always used to hide judgment behind concern. "It's your father. He had a panic attack yesterday. We had to call the ambulance. He's okay now, but they wouldn't release him until we settled some billing issues. There's something wrong with the insurance. I don't understand what's going on." I stood perfectly still, letting her words settle over me like dust. Not replying, not confirming or denying anything, just listening. Her breathing was uneven, and I could hear the rustle of her robe, or maybe a blanket in the background, the soft clink of a coffee cup being set down on the kitchen counter I used to wipe clean every night without being asked. "The VA isn't picking up," she continued, her voice growing slightly more frantic. "And they said there's a hold on your father's account. They think someone submitted a fraud report, but that doesn't make sense, because we've done everything by the book." Still, I said nothing. "I know things were said," she added, her tone now teetering between forced humility and her old habit of guilt-tripping. "But I need you to be honest with me. Did you do something? Melissa, if you did something out of spite, this isn't just about you and me anymore. This is your father's life we're talking about." Finally, I spoke, but not in defense, not in anger, and not with the kind of emotion she was hoping to stir out of me. I spoke with precision, with calm, like someone untangling a knot, rather than swinging a bat. "I didn't do anything illegal," I said, "but I did take back control. You both made it clear I was a burden. I believed you." The silence on the other end was the kind that cuts, not because it's loud, but because it carries weight, history, and every unspoken thing we both wished we had said years ago, when there was still time to fix it. "Melissa, please," she said, her voice cracking in a way that might have broken me years ago. "He's scared. I'm scared. We're not well. You were always the one who handled things. I'm asking you, not as your mother, but as someone who's out of options. Help us." And that's when I realized the most painful truth of all. She didn't see me as a daughter, not really. I was a utility, a tool, a resource that had stopped being convenient. And now that everything was falling apart, she was reaching for me not out of love, not even out of regret, but because I had always been the one to fix things. And old habits, as they say, die hard. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I simply inhaled slowly and exhaled even slower, feeling the weight of every moment I had swallowed my voice in that house, every sacrifice I had made without thanks, every night I had chosen to protect them over myself. "I'm sorry you're experiencing that," I said. And the moment those words left my mouth, I felt something shift permanently between us, like a rope finally snapping after years of strain. She didn't respond. For a moment, I thought she might have hung up, but I could still hear her breathing. I could hear her confusion, her disbelief, maybe even her anger brewing underneath. But I had nothing else to give. I was no longer their insurance policy in human form. After the call ended, I sat in the silence of my small apartment, a space I had once seen as temporary, but was starting to feel like a sanctuary. And I let the stillness wash over me, not as punishment, but as relief. I didn't feel triumphant, and I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something far more unfamiliar: peace. A kind of quiet that wasn't charged with tension or hidden expectations, just the absence of noise that didn't belong to me anymore. That afternoon, I went for a walk through the neighborhood, passing families walking dogs, children riding bikes, couples arguing gently over groceries. For the first time, I looked at these strangers and didn't feel like I was watching life from the sidelines. I didn't feel like I had to explain myself, defend myself, or even be understood. I was simply allowed to be. But that peace was disrupted again 3 days later. Not by a call this time, but by a letter, thin, official-looking, and addressed from a law firm I recognized as the one my parents had used for their wills and estate planning. I opened it with steady hands, and as my eyes scanned the page, a bitter smile crept across my face. They were suing me, alleging financial interference, emotional cruelty, and elder abuse. Yes, elder abuse, from the very people who once asked me to sign their medical forms and manage their prescriptions, now painting me as a cold, calculating villain. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. But I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch, because I had receipts. Literal ones. Every payment I'd made, every month I'd covered their expenses, every medical form I'd submitted. And more than that, I had something they couldn't take back. The truth. I set the letter down and looked out the window again. The sky was turning that late evening color of gold and gray, the kind that makes you think about all the roads not taken, all the choices that could have gone another way. And I realized, no matter what came next, I wasn't going back. They could throw lawyers, threats, and guilt at me, but they had already lost the one thing they never valued until it was gone, my loyalty. And this time, I wasn't going to save them from themselves. There is a certain kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but unsettles, a silence that creeps beneath your skin, into your bloodstream, wrapping itself around your bones, and refuses to let go, not because it is peaceful, but because it carries within it the echoes of everything that was said too late and everything that was never said at all. That was the kind of silence I walked into. The morning I stepped into the courthouse, dressed not in vengeance or arrogance, but in a muted navy blazer and slacks. I hadn't worn since my last in-person interview. My shoes polished more out of reflex than vanity, because even when you're walking into battle with the very people who raised you, something in your upbringing tells you to look presentable when your life is being dissected. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Not the kind you see on television with a full gallery and dramatic lighting, but something intimate, bureaucratic, almost mundane, with gray walls and stiff chairs and a judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but here, presiding over what was supposed to be a simple civil hearing between a daughter and her aging parents. On paper, a case about money, authority, and mismanagement, but in truth, a lifetime's worth of resentment, neglect, and buried betrayal laid bare. Under fluorescent lights and legal formalities. When they entered, I saw the toll that the last few weeks had taken on them. My mother looked older than I remembered. Her hair pulled back too tightly, her eyes scanning the room not with confidence but with apprehension, as if she knew, on some level, that this was a war she'd already lost before the first word was spoken. My father, thinner now, walked with a slight limp, the same one he always dramatized when visitors were over, but now it looked less like performance and more like consequence. They avoided my eyes, and I made no effort to meet theirs. I sat quietly at my table, next to the lawyer I'd hired not just for her legal expertise, but for her ability to understand the nuances of family dysfunction with the precision of a surgeon. The hearing began without theatrics. Their lawyer spoke first, outlining the claims of elder abuse, financial interference, emotional cruelty, a list of accusations so absurd it would have been laughable if it didn't carry the weight of their belief behind it. They spoke of confusion, of feeling betrayed, of fear that I had overstepped my bounds and used their trust against them, twisting my role as caregiver into something predatory. They didn't mention the years I'd paid their bills. They didn't mention the meals cooked, the appointments scheduled, the nights spent arguing with insurance companies while they slept peacefully upstairs. Those parts, it seemed, had been conveniently redacted from their memories. When it was our turn, my lawyer handed the judge a stack of documents, receipts, bank statements, email threads, medical forms, all showing not only my financial contributions, but also the legality of every action I'd taken under the authority they themselves had granted me. I didn't need to speak. The paper trail did all the talking. I watched as my mother's mouth tightened, her jaw clenched, and her eyes blinked rapidly, as if the reality was finally catching up to the story they had constructed. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, no longer the patriarch in control, but an aging man who'd gambled away his dignity and lost. The judge, to his credit, didn't draw it out. After reviewing the documentation, he dismissed their claims with little ceremony, stating that no evidence of abuse or misconduct had been found and that the power of attorney had been executed and exercised within legal bounds. It was over in minutes, a case that, in truth, had taken decades to create, undone in less time than it takes to make a pot of coffee. I stood, not triumphant, not gloating, but calm, and when I turned to leave, I caught my mother's eyes for a brief, electric second. There was no rage there, no plea, just recognition, the kind of recognition that comes when someone finally sees the full shape of what they've created and realizes too late that it cannot be undone. I didn't look back. Later that night, in the quiet of my apartment, I set the table for one. It was something I'd started doing, not because I expected company, but because it reminded me that I was worth making space for, even if it was just for myself. I lit a candle, cheap, lavender-scented, probably from the clearance bin, but it flickered warmly, casting soft shadows against the walls. The meal was simple: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a glass of wine I didn't really need but poured anyway. I sat in the quiet, fork in hand, staring at the empty chair across from me. And then, almost without thinking, I spoke aloud, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of calm that only comes when everything has already burned down, and all that's left is truth. Dead weight doesn't carry you for 10 years. The words didn't echo, didn't bounce off the walls like something grand or cinematic. They just sat there, soft and solid, filling the room like a long exhale. For a long time, I stayed like that, still listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's television, the occasional creak of pipes behind the drywall. And in that silence, I realized something even more profound than the victory in court or the satisfaction of walking away. I didn't hate them. I didn't wish them harm. But I also didn't owe them anything anymore. Not my time, not my money, not my forgiveness. The knock came just after midnight. 3 soft, deliberate taps on the door. No urgency, no follow-up. I froze, wineglass halfway to my lips, heart suddenly alert. For a moment I considered not answering, letting it pass like a strange dream. But curiosity got the better of me, and I stood, walked slowly across the room, and opened the door. And there, standing in the hallway, framed by the dull glow of the exit sign, was someone I hadn't expected. Though whether it was Eric, my father, my mother, or someone else entirely, I won't say. Because what matters isn't who was there, but what it meant. That even when you close the door on a past that tried to strangle you, sometimes it finds a way to knock again. Not to beg forgiveness or offer reconciliation, but to remind you that freedom isn't a one-time choice. It's a commitment you have to make, over and over, every time the ghosts come calling. And as I stood there, looking into that face, hearing nothing but the pounding of my own pulse, I realized that silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of peace, and the price of keeping it.